George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
MickJagger's in a ball gown, or with people in ball gowns, at the Palace of Versailles at a state banquet for King Charles and Queen Camilla. Whatever happened to that street-fighting man? In fact, is he not Sir MickJagger, if you can get your head round that idea? Well, the United Nations organization, you know what? I think it's a complete waste of time. Unless you're in the Republic of the Congo, because it gives you the chance to overthrow your tyrant puppet president when he's on that shopping trip to New York, which, let's face it, is all that it is for the great majority of world leaders today. And the online safety bill becomes law in Britain. The state regulator, Ofcom, is smacking its lips at the opportunity of protecting us from harmful content. But who will decide what is harmful content? Mind you, that's not much different from what's happening now, where Google, for me, rule my world. Not only have they demonetized he who must not be named, they suppressed my show on Sunday for speaking about him who may not be named. I promise you, this is going to be a bumpy night tonight. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Mind you, Sir Mick was not the most important Brit that little Emperor Macron met today. Sir Keir Starmer, another knight of the realm, was unusually ushered into the Elysee to meet the sitting president. Doesn't happen often that the leader of the so-called opposition in a parliament gets an audience with the president himself, but it soon became clear who had arranged it. Sir Tony Blair. We're infested by these knights of the realm. Knights, I said. And why was Sir Tony Blair brokering a meeting for Sir Keir Starmer with Emperor Macron? That has now become clear also. Starmer was there to tell Macron that if he wins the next general election in Britain, which, let's face it, he'd have to be some kind of corporal clot to lose, given the state of the Conservative Party, his main priority will be to draw Britain closer. That's code for associate membership, at least, of the European Union. Because, of course, it's all going so well in the European Union. The beaches at Dover, forget it. Have you seen Lampedusa? Well, the number of arrivals in boats in the last week has tripled the population of the island, 2/3 of them being actually Africans who merely landed on Italian territory. Prime Minister Maloney wants out of the pact with China. She's thrown her lot in with the European Union and with the United States of America, but not to the benefit of her constituents or her compatriots. Starmer intends to reverse the decision made by the largest number of British people ever to vote for anything in all of our democratic history. Mind you, that democratic history is drawing to a close. Take a look at our poll that we're running this evening. What rules the West? Google, NATO, or democracy? I'll come on to it in a minute. But on my Telegram, only 3% think democracy rules the West. On Twitter, only 8%. On the YouTube community poll, only 5%. And only 2% of those of you watching on the YouTube stream. Nobody much believes in democracy in the West anymore. Well, that's actually not strictly speaking true. Nobody much believes in the people who sit at the top of the so-called democracies in the West. If it's a question of government of the people, for the people, by the people, who would in their right mind turn that down? But when you see what it produces, little soldier Schultz and bonkers Baerbock, little Macron, little Sunak, I'm not sure which of these is the shortest, metaphorically or literally. When you see Joe Biden at the United Nations like a demented robot that has gone haywire, I was waiting for his arms to begin to clunk like his voice clunked. The funniest part of it was when in the middle of a literally indecipherable rant that no one in the auditorium could understand a word of, he said 3 words suddenly, clearly. And those 3 clear words were, "Let me be clear." And people started to laugh in the auditorium. "Let me be clear," said Joe, the robot, when in fact everything he'd said before and after was as clear as a door painted black. The United Nations is a farce. In fact, it was comedic as I watched this week. The Israeli ambassador picked up a rather tawdry-looking paper placard and started marching down the aisle in protest at the speech being given by the president of Iran. He was then huckled out of the United Nations, the Israeli ambassador, by security guards trying to handcuff him because he would not stop behaving like a hooligan. The fact that, well, do you know what was on the little piece of paper he was holding up? It was in support of women in Iran, while the government he represents at the United Nations is murdering women almost on a weekly basis, murdering women journalists, some of them American citizens, shooting teenagers dead in their beds this morning in Jenin. He's representing one of the most bloodthirsty, murderous regimes on the earth, and he's disrupting the proceedings of the United Nations in protest at the president of Iran. Now, of course, Zelensky arrived. He has $27 billion more to pick up for a few dollars more. He'll turn up anywhere. But the audience listening to his unhinged speech spoke volumes about the paling, fading support for his regime. In the United Nations, in the media, amongst the political class, even amongst the governments of America's vassal states, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, and perhaps most crucially, his fading support within the armed forces of Ukraine who increasingly have had enough. Enough of this poison dwarf and his larcenous government, looting one in every $3 that arrives, selling military equipment destined for the front on the dark web and to any armed robber, any criminal gang, any terrorist outfit that will purchase them. If you want a measure of how people are falling out of love with the former porn actor Zelensky, you could look at the audience 3/4 empty when he addressed the United Nations, or you could look on the front page of the New York Times on the day he arrived in New York. No coincidence there. A special New York Times investigation has shown that the murderous missile attack on a marketplace in Donetsk, which killed 15 people and maimed 17 more, when Blinken was in Kiev, which was denounced by Blinken and Zelensky and echoed, parroted throughout the Western mainstream media, turned out not to have been a Russian missile at all. It was not Russia that murdered these people in the marketplace. It was Zelensky himself, either through incompetence, that's possible, or any deliberate provocation in the presence of Blinken. All these people's blood was spilt. Fair play to the New York Times, and great timing. They revealed the entire miserable canard on the front page of the Times on the day that Zelensky arrived in New York. For me, the United Nations is a pale shadow of what it once was and what it was supposed to be. When I was young, everybody in the world knew the name of the Secretary General of the United Nations. He was never off the TV, never out of the newspapers, always shuttling here and there, trying to bring peace where there was conflict, trying to broker deals and agreements, to keep a lid on the simmering tensions of the Cold War world. Who knows who's the Secretary General of the United Nations now? Do you know? Can you pronounce his name? Have you heard about his fear of flying? Well, he must have a fear of flying because he never leaves New York. He doesn't intervene in any conflict anywhere in the world. The Pope does more for peace than the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now let me move on to a very important matter that I need to get off my chest. YouTube is owned by Google. Google was elected by nobody. And even prior to the passage of the OnlineSafetyBill in the UK, to which I shall turn in a minute, Google acted as the #1 censor of information in the world today. There is nobody that they will not censor. Elected presidents, they'll censor. King's councils giving evidence to parliamentary inquiries on the disease, ailment that must not speak its name for fear of suppression by Google. This very day, a King's Council giving evidence in Parliament has been censored by Google. Who gave them the authority to do this. Nobody. They are too powerful for their own good and certainly for the good of society as a whole. We have been mugs, allowing these people, Zuckerberg too, to accrue all this power to interfere in our democracy. You want democracy, but you want a mogul somewhere, a billionaire, in the case of Google, a trillionaire to decide what information you can access and what information will be denied to you, even if it's in a parliamentary inquiry and spoken by a King's Council. Why did we allow these people to accrue such overweening, overbearing, and unbearable power? Well, we went quietly into that good night. We were so excited about the existence of social media. It did not occur to us that the more we used it, the more money the trillionaire earned and the more power he had at any time to turn off the tap, to deny platforms to people, to demonetize people, only on accusations, not even charges, never mind convictions, although there's some odd people there with multiple convictions that are still monetized and have still got platforms on Google, on YouTube. By the end of this talk, maybe it's already happened. I may no longer even be speaking to you on YouTube. Such is the power that these people have accrued, and it is profoundly unhealthy to our democracy that a tiny handful of people, the 10 richest people in the world, almost all of whom are in this internet business in one way or another, own more wealth than 40% of the entire population of the world, as President Lula told the United Nations today, just before he felt too tired to meet with President Zelensky. I had to go home, had a cough, was fatigued. These 10 individuals who own all this media power are the real rulers of the public space. How did we allow this? And how can we circumvent it? For circumvent it we must. If he who cannot be named, for fear of Google immediately suppressing this broadcast, as they did on Sunday, can be demonetized on the simple accusation of someone, then how much longer are the rest of us for this public square? After all, anybody at all can be accused of anything at all. No evidence needs to be produced. No trial needs to be held. No judge, no court, no jury. Google and their friends are the judge, jury, and executioner. Until today, when the British Parliament passed with flying colours the Online Safety Bill. Now, of course, the bill is wrapped up in pretty paper. Going to crack down on exploitation of children, on extreme pornography, on all the ugliness that is to be found if you look for it on the internet. But that's not their real reason. That's not the reason why Ofcom are literally licking their lips. I saw the video of the woman in charge. She couldn't have been more pleased if she'd won the Euro millions on the lottery. Because now she can decide that what I am saying to you now about her is harmful to you and therefore must be taken down, must be censored. Who will guard the guards? The age-old question. Who will decide what is harmful? Well, in my country of Scotland, that's already decided. Police Scotland has set up a special unit. Imagine. Get your house burgled, forget it. Here's a crime number, claim off the insurance. Your car stolen, ditto. Your face slashed in the street. You'll be lucky if you've any blood left before the police arrive. But they've got a special unit just been set up to police the hate crimes bill starting in November, just a few weeks from now. And you know what their two priorities are? To crack down on the misgendering of people and on the people who try to stop biological males going into female toilets. Well, I've got news for you, Mr. Yousaf and Mr. Police Scotland. I will not be calling Junior Sergeant 4th Class Sarah Cirillo, the erstwhile spokeswoman man, it, them, they, of the Ukrainian regime. I will not be calling her a woman. I will be, in terms of your law, misgendering her. That guy with the big swinging dick in the women's prison at Cornton Vale, raping prisoners and staff, I will not be calling a woman. And there are 4 females in my household. And if I see any man dressed as a woman lumbering into the ladies' lavatory when they're inside, I'll be stopping him, her, it, they, them. All right. I'll stop them with extreme prejudice. They'll have to climb over me to get into that lady's toilet when my family are there. I told you it was going to be a bumpy night. You better fasten your seatbelt. This is the mother of all talk shows. I defy anyone to contradict the point that I just made, that every person alive today was born of woman. So why would we say that the people in the labor wards, in the maternity units, are people who are giving birth? Why can't we say women? Why can't we say mothers? Why can't we say women who are breastfeeding, mothers who are breastfeeding? Why do we need to say people who are chest feeding? All of these words, and indeed all of the trend that you say you dissociate yourself from, of transgenderism, transmania, I call it, are all taking rights away from women.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Well, the best broadcast I have seen in years, maybe ever, was the interview of Colonel Douglas Macgregor with Tucker Carlson. It was literally a master class. It was a tour of the battlefield, not just the actual battlefield in the Ukraine, but the political, military, strategic battlefield on which we are all engaged, possibly for the final battle, possibly for the battle that ends war and ends all of us on this planet forever. Now, of course, we introduced Colonel Douglas Macgregor to you several times on the mother of all talk shows before he got his big break with Tucker Carlson. But he hasn't forgotten us. He's agreed to come back and talk to us on the mother of all talk shows this evening, and I'm very glad to say he joins me now. Colonel Macgregor, it was the big time. You've been in the big time for a long time, in the Pentagon, in the White House, in your military career, on the mother of all talk shows. But there you were now in the stratosphere with Tucker. But it didn't overawe you. You took the program by the scruff of the neck, and Carlson was spellbound by your grasp of detail. Tell us on a human level, first of all, how has that been for you, being such a star on a Carlson show?
Well, George, I usually think of myself as a star when I'm with you, so I guess in that sense it wasn't anything new.
Very kind. Now, before we go to the battleground, Colonel, let's talk about the battleground, if you like, at the UN and in the US Congress. Zelensky was as popular as a pork chop at a Muslim wedding, with a lot of the delegates in the United Nations this week. And it turns out there's not enough votes in the Congress to give him the money he's really there to collect. He's losing on the political battlefield, isn't he?
Yeah, I think James Brown said it best, the thrill is gone. And our friend Zelensky is very definitely in the loser's corner. Nobody wants to state it publicly, but everybody knows tragically Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of men, I would argue pointlessly, in a war for all the wrong reasons. The Russians are sitting comfortably behind their defenses, and everyone is wondering when the Russians will attack and finish this war. But I think from the very beginning, Putin never had any intention of conquering Western Ukraine and moving into Eastern Europe, contrary to what the propagandists in your country and mine have said. There's no payoff. Territorial imperialism is a loser. He simply wants this war to end. He wants to liberate the Russians living in Eastern Ukraine from the oppressive rule of Mr. Zelensky and his friends, and he would like to get back to normalcy, wants to get back to doing business. And I think the Europeans need to wake up as soon as possible, because the sooner they wake up, the more improvement they will see in their lives. But they've got a long way to go with the governments ruling them. And unfortunately, we're ruled by people not very different from the ones you're discussing in Great Britain right now. They also need to go. We need normality. We need to get away from all of this artificial nonsense. We need to get away from what Roger Scruton used to call the nonsense machine. You've got a nonsense machine in London and apparently also in Edinburgh, sadly. We have a nonsense machine in Washington. It all needs to stop, because all of this is about money, unfortunately, in the United States. And lots of people are getting rich in Washington, D.C., while the Ukrainian people are being killed and their nation is being destroyed.
Well, I didn't intend to be speaking to you about this, but I did see that you had weighed in one of your political initiatives that you're welcome to brief us on this nonsense machine. I've seen a lot, Colonel, as a man of my age and more than 50 years in politics. I ought to have seen a lot. But I have never seen a conquering of the public space, the institutions, the commanding heights of the society as quickly and as comprehensively as I have seen over this nonsense machine, the transmania, the gender-bending, all-consuming triumph of people that we were all absolutely content to see an end to discrimination against, all happy to see a dampening of bigotry towards. But we are now in a situation, Colonel, you may not be in your country, but I am in mine, that it is a crime for which I can be sent to prison if I do not call a man a woman because that man has decreed himself to be a woman. It is a crime that could put you behind bars. How did we get there?
Well, it looks like the people that dominate our financial system and control the money are the same people who currently dominate the government, who are shaping society, who are controlling academia. They've effectively taken over the airwaves. And so they can make something that's utterly ridiculous, like this war in Ukraine, and portray it as though it's some victory for them and for their ruling class, when in fact we know the Ukrainians have been slaughtered in this war. We've set them up for failure. We tried to build an army on the fly. We sent them into action, promising them virtually everything and anything, and they've reached the point now where they have nothing left to fight with. And so now we're handing them cruise missiles, and they're going to hurl those pointlessly at targets in Russia or wherever they can reach. It's not going to change anything, but it could ultimately induce the Russians to finally say, let's attack and end this thing once and for all. Russian commanders are telling President Putin they want to drive their tanks right into Kiev and destroy this regime once and for all, which they now view, and I think they're right, as a danger not only to them, but a danger to the people living in Ukraine and living in Europe. These people are dangerous. They represent everything that you're talking about. They have a spokesperson who is a man dressed as a woman. Whether or not this person has been through some sort of transgender surgery, I have no idea. But this thing spouts utter nonsense and is held up as an example by Zelensky in the West as something we all ought to worship. This has got to stop. This doesn't make any sense. It's the nonsense machine in charge. We've turned the world upside down. I don't have any easy answers other than to say we've got to resist. I know my ancestors resisted a hell of a lot in Scotland over many centuries. And I suppose that's why I'm sitting where I am in the United States now, because they finally decided to give up and leave. But I hope that the people in Great Britain will resist and stand up and essentially talk about the nonsense and stop it. Because we've got to. We've been lied to about everything. We're being lied to about gender and biology and genetics, lied about what's right, what's wrong. And we don't need PhDs, and we don't need to spend time in seminaries to figure out what's right, what's wrong, and what's real.
Indeed, let's move to another part of the battlefield. The ground seems to be shifting in the Congress over the latest of what have been a series of voracious financial demands by Zelensky. I read just before coming on air that Biden will not have enough votes to get another huge payment, a huge payout. Is that how you see it?
There are 37 million people inside the United States living below the poverty line. There are 11 million children, American children, who go to bed hungry every night. Now, what's wrong with this picture? We want to send billions and hundreds of billions to Ukraine to fight a war that makes no sense against a people that are not the enemy of the American people, or for that matter, in my judgment, Europe. We should be interested in peace, not shipping hundreds of billions of dollars overseas. People in the country are beginning to say, wait a minute, 37 million Americans live in poverty. 11 million children are going to bed hungry every night. This is outrageous nonsense. It needs to stop. That's what's happening.
And is that putting pressure on the Republican leadership in the House, which has been bipartisan on foreign policy issues, at least, with the Democrats in lockstep? Are they beginning to move now?
Well, I think we still have what we call the uniparty. That is, the Republicans and Democrats are all interested in the same thing. They want to line their pockets with as much cash as possible and go home as multimillionaires. You know, this is not the way this government was originally designed. We didn't build this government with that in mind, but that's what's happened for the last 30, 40 years. All sorts of people have showed up in Washington who are only modestly wealthy, if we can use that word at all. But they all ended up retiring after 5 or 6 terms in office with millions of dollars. This has become an industry, a self-licking ice cream cone, if you want. And we're doing the same thing with defense right now. I mean, we had the chief financial officer of Lockheed Martin, one of the top 5 defense firms, speak publicly and talk about the wonderful prospects for profits in the future. He said, we've got $10 billion more orders on the way now, thanks to Ukraine. And after we've gotten these $10 billion for the missiles we're shipping to Ukraine, we're going to get 10 billion more to replace all the missiles we just sent. Now, most of this cash just sort of circulates in Washington. It goes from Congress to the Department of Defense, from the Department of Defense to its constituents and its donors. The donors turn around and enrich the people on the Hill. They refill their election campaign funds or re-election campaign funds. This is a giant money laundering scheme. It's not doing anything for the people of Ukraine. It's not doing anything for the people here in the United States. We've got 28 million, an estimated 28 million people living in the United States who are illegally here. And most of them, I would say over 90% of them, enjoy free health care at the expense of American taxpayers. At the same time, we've got 27 million Americans who have no health insurance. What is wrong with this picture? This is ridiculous. We are impoverishing ourselves and enriching a small elite, but that elite is owned by the people you're talking about, by the ruling class that controls finance. That's why we financialized our economy. We don't build anything anymore. We're not producing steel and other components. We are financialized. Everything's about transaction fees, George. It's the same thing in London. You saw the financial crisis in September that removed your previous prime minister and brought in Sunak. Has anything really changed since that financial crisis? And that was essentially saved by the Bank of England that they promised to buy up some number of gilts. Well, we've got the same problem here in the United States. Rising interest rates. You know, the bond yields are going up, but the prices for bonds are going down, and fewer people overseas want to buy our bonds. You know, how long will it be before the banks in the United States and in Great Britain figure out that they're holding on to tremendous numbers of liabilities, not assets? They bought all these gilts and bonds when the interest rates were at 0 or 1 or less than 2%. Now what are they worth? With the interest rates rising rapidly to 5%. And there's no evidence that these interest rates can be contained. They're going to continue to go up. We're headed for a serious crisis. And I think the people in charge are making serious mistakes because they're still focused on themselves, not on the country and the people that live in our countries.
In this tinderbox, which you so eloquently describe, what would be the impact of a successful effort to keep Donald Trump out of the next presidential race, either by lawfare, by even the possibility of imprisonment, by some other means, including the possibility of extreme prejudice, which you can never rule out in the United States? What would be the impact on the tinderbox were that to happen, do you think?
You know, we can only speculate. We can't know with absolute certainty, but remember that the majority of Americans that voted for Donald Trump are frankly people that obey the law. They're not the people that you saw destroy $2.1 billion worth of property in the United States in 2020. The average Trump voter is a law-abiding citizen. So I don't expect some outburst of violence. But, there's something else happening that you may not be aware of, but there is a candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he is very similar to Trump in many of his views. They're not exactly the same by any means, but I would describe both of them as legitimate, valid candidates for two distinct parties, except that the two parties don't like them, don't want them. Robert F. Kennedy isn't sure that he has a real shot in the primaries to get the nomination because he's afraid it's going to be rigged against him. And he's brought this up. Someone just tried to kill him the other day, and he's being denied Secret Service protection. We all know that President Trump has been at risk for a long time. I don't really know. I think what we're looking at, though, in the future, sometime over the next 6 to 12 months, is the perfect storm. On the one side, the financial system is going to go into crisis. I don't see how we escape it. On the other side, we have the political dispute with this uniparty, with people that we can't seem to control, people that are completely unresponsive to the population and its needs. If you ask the average American, what do you think about Ukraine? He's probably going to ask you, where is it? The next American you ask about Ukraine, he says, well, I don't think we should go to war over this place. I mean, there's no support for a war against Russia 7,000 or 8,000 miles from the United States. There's no support for a war with China over some island off the coast called Taiwan. Americans, and I don't know what it's like in Britain, but I can tell you Americans are very worried about putting bread on the table. You talked about the immense wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. We've got a lot of people in the United States living now paycheck to paycheck. The average American has perhaps $4,000-$5,000 in savings. How long is that going to last? Particularly given the financialization of our economy, the rising interest rates. How does the average American get credit? Credit is tightening. That's no accident as the interest rates go up. So I think we're headed into some sort of perfect storm. So to sit here and predict how people will react, it's hard to tell. But if they can't eat, if they can't put food on the table, if they can't get to work because they can't afford to put gas in their automobiles, if they can't afford to stay in the homes that they own, I think you're headed for a lot of trouble.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor, it's always absolutely fascinating talking to you. I'm proud you're a compatriot of mine, albeit separated by an ocean. Thank you for joining me on the mother of all talk shows. What an interview. If you want to comment on it, you can do so entirely free of charge. In the UK and Ireland, 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. And it's toll free in the United States and Canada. +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. And in the rest of the world, it's 44203 966 2625. I'll be right back with a legend on the line after this short break. Stay tuned.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You've been thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, you know, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that at least.
You've got that on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know
the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before it was published, but actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
You can see that film for free on my Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. Please support me on Patreon. I really do depend on it. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I need your support on Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. I've got great friends on there who are keeping me going with this show, like James Butler, who says, Google is used to manipulate the UN, the WEF, amongst others. Tell us we are guilty of helping to kill the planet, yet the American corporate tool that is NATO is busy starting and funding war after war, and yet not a word. And Hill, H-I-L, says it's in the power of ordinary people to self-determine our future, but Western NATO governments are determined to keep their imperialist project alive. And John H. says clearly the answer is NATO, but behind NATO looms the United States. And in saying the United States, I mean a small cabal of individuals who somehow have gained control of America. And Shlomo Orr says it's the military-industrial security complex which controls NATO. And Monica Rangne says definitely not democracy. Well, Monica, that much is clear from the results of the poll. It was a hard choice for me, she says, between Google, which is pretty much worldwide and controls so much info, and NATO, which is trying to spread control all over the world. Thanks to you for those comments and for your ongoing support. You can support me on Patreon for less than the price of a cup of tea per week. I'm talking about tea in an insalubrious cafe, not in Claridge's or the Ritz. It's very, very small money. But if a lot of people do it, you'll really strengthen this operation. Please do it if you possibly can. Now, there's a legend on the line. It's Simon, our professor in Florida on the United Nations Security Council. Go ahead, Professor Simon.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Greetings to you and to your worldwide audience. If I may, I'm going to gently disagree with you and recount what happened in the United Nations General Assembly Hall after President Biden finished his speech. And I don't know exactly where you saw your version, but possibly it was on the mainstream media and not on the raw feed on the United Nations webcams. But I'll explain, if I may, very quickly what happened immediately afterwards, why that response occurred, and what the Chinese said a few hours later, just 2 sentences of their response, because it's very, very dramatic. Now, when President Biden started speaking, most of the diplomats in the assembly hall jumped from their seats and literally ran around talking to each other for many minutes. And the president of the assembly was not able to regain control. He had summoned the next speaker, who was the president of Ecuador, who stood patiently and then impatiently at the rostrum awaiting his turn. It took 7 or 8 minutes to get most of the delegates back into their seats, during which time, while shouting for order, the new General Assembly president was slamming his gavel up upon his stand behind the speaker's area so hard and so repetitively that he snapped the head of his gavel, which was a gift from Iceland, into 2, and he then turned to the Secretary General and said, "I don't know what to do. They're not listening. I've never seen anything like this." Okay? Now, so that
and what was the reason? What was the reason,
now,
Simon?
So I'll tell you the reason, and frankly, this is scary for the whole world. So President Biden, despite your correct description of his generally being a bumbling buffoon, one needs to remember that he was trying to read out a speech that no doubt somebody else or some other collective or cabal had written for him. Now, twice, not once, but twice, he said that and this is a direct quote, the United States was going to bend the arc of history. And I suspect many in the audience there interpreted that to say, you will bend to the will of the United States. So that got quite a response. He once again reiterated his phrase about us being at an inflection point. And he was very clear that the United States was asserting leadership over the world. And indeed, though this may have been a mistake where he meant to say the United Nations, but he in fact said the US, he said America is abiding by the principle of the US in terms of its leadership of the world. So he didn't say we're abiding by the charter or the principles of the UN. He said we're abiding by the principles of the US. And there are several other incidences in his speech of that magnitude, which I appreciate we don't have time to go through the whole 15 minutes. But it was very, very threatening. And that was why there was such an extreme response from all of the delegates there. He attacked Russia, as may have been expected. He attacked North Korea. He attacked Iran. He started off being conciliatory to China and then said that America had to push back against them in the seas and in the skies in order to maintain freedom of navigation. So I think if one were to go back and, despite the laughable character, actually listen to what had been typed up for him by unknown hands, and then think that all the other delegations doubtless received the written version or a transcript later. This is why the Chinese reacted in the way they did, and I'll just read 2 sentences. They said, quote, U.S. President Biden has again turned the United Nations General Assembly into a runway for touting U.S. leadership. He made the Ukraine crisis the spotlight of the gathering to shore up the alliance of U.S.-centered small cliques and use the crisis as a weapon to attack other countries. So that is what happened.
Well, you watched all of that so that I don't have to. And you have succinctly, in précis, told us of the significance and importance of the event. Just one other question, Simon, if I may. How was Zelensky received by the different delegations? If you know, please tell us.
There's a huge split there. So it was revealed that all of the European delegates had a sole goal, which was to promote Zelensky and his 10-point peace plan. So the entire UN has basically split 50 against 140. But as it's been described by both the Chinese and by Secretary Blinken, Biden's using the term inflection point. The Chinese are using the point of a crossroads in the history of humanity, at which point countries now need to make a choice. Where we really are at a hard decision point, what in military parlance would be called the decision point of battle, where you're forced to make a decision, and what you decide is going to determine the outcome. And that's exactly what Secretary Blinken said when he said how countries decide now is going to determine the outcome of world history for the next few decades. I know I repeat this point every week, but these are truly incredible times that we're going through. So in terms of your question as to how he was responded, 50 people were basically told clap when he gets on the stage, and the other 140 people were sitting there going, oh, God, this guy in a green uniform again. But don't forget that he had a double act. He was there on the big stage in the big hall yesterday, and then he was in the small hall at the United Nations Security Council today, and that was an enormously drawn-out performance where the Russians had been somewhat tucked up and they were rather outgained by the Albanian rotating president of the Security Council, such that he had invited or allowed something like an additional 50 countries to address the Security Council, all supporting Ukraine, handed the Russians that list at short notice, and they hadn't got all of their allies along at the meeting, so they were literally outnumbered about 60 to 1. Big speech from Mr. Blinken again, an enormous, literally like reading out a book speech from Secretary Lavrov, and then Mr. Zelensky reiterating his 10-point peace plan and asking not for one global summit to discuss it, but for 11 global summits, a summit for each of the 10 points, and then a president and prime minister summit to draw a conclusion and then enforce it upon Russia. So there have been incredible developments. It would be disrespectful to your other callers to try and encompass all of the Security Council meeting, but I would please, if I may, just make the one point to you and your audience that the most amazing speech so far was in fact the speech that came after President Biden by the president of Colombia. And the scope of his speech that was dedicated to his wife, his daughter, and his grandchildren was from the cocoa fields in the forests of Colombia, extending in scope to the stars of the universe. It was absolutely amazing, but has been overshadowed by the preceding speech from President Biden.
Well, I'll definitely look that up. Finally, and briefly, Simon, because we're at the hour almost, don't we really have two United Nations? Wouldn't it make more sense for this organization to split and let the tiny number of North American vassal states and prison states like Albania, it's amusing to me that they should be the president of the Security Council, I must say. Shouldn't we leave them to it and set up a proper United Nations on a democratic basis somewhere else?
Very quickly, Mr. Galloway, there is a specific factual answer to that. We're in the process now where they're supposed to be negotiating what is called the Pact of the Future, that is designed to be agreed by consensus at the Summit of the Future of the World next year. And that was one of the extreme statements that President Biden made. He suggested that even though that booklet is literally 5 chapter headings, there's no words under the chapter headings at the moment, it's to be negotiated over the next year. He said that America felt there was already a common vision for the future, basically implying that you're going all to do what America tells you, so we don't even need to negotiate the content of the agreement that's supposed to only be finalized in 12 months' time. So people are trying to hold the UN together, but America is very, very strong in exercising its hegemonic power to the dissatisfaction of at least half of the United Nations.
Thank you, Simon, in Florida, as always, for that briefing. Lots of calls and emails and messages after this short break. Stay tuned.
Mr. President, we got a report of a 50-foot woman marauding through Washington, sir.
Thank you, Captain. But I'm looking for a shorter woman, one who likes to take long strolls in the park and yell at minorities.
She's not looking for a date. She's terrorizing the city.
Is there a difference? A little levity. Call in the military.
We are the military, sir.
Boy, we got here fast. We better do something, right?
Shall I scramble the jets, Mr. President?
No, thanks. I'll just take a muffin and some coffee.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
An email from John, and our email address is onair@moats.tv. George, please call out Biden for condemning Russia while under his orders the US military is illegally occupying 1/3 of Syria and stealing 1 million barrels of oil a month and food grain for the people. Hypocrisy, have I ever offended thee? John Mackesy in California. Thanks, John. Clayton is in Texas and wants to react to Colonel Macgregor. Clayton, welcome to the show. What would you like to say?
Well, first I would like to say it's an honor, and I hope this is only the first of many communications with you and your team. And what I would like to say is,
thank you.
Smedley Butler was right. All wars are bankers' wars. But what happened to Smedley Butler, besides his speech about that, the business plot? I have something to tell you. It's not very often I get a chance to school a professor. The League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, was, as intended, part of a control structure. Wilson was controlled by a handler, Edward House, who wrote a book, Philip Drew Administrator. In my analysis, we must understand the problem. Colonel Macgregor, yourself, and others have been asking these questions, and I have been trying to understand these problems since I got out of the Marine Corps, and now I am running for president. So as an independent, as a dark horse candidate, I have very little resources. I'm not a political person, but I'm standing up for what's right. And part of this analysis is that the Rhodesian group, I mean, Cecil Rhodes himself said, why should we not form a secret society, but with one object, the furtherance of the British Empire and the bringing of the whole world under British rule for the recovery of the United States? See, and when I trace the main foreign policy influence on the United States, it's mostly roundtable groups, CFR, that are really Chatham House extensions. So if we're going to talk about NATO and NATO entanglements, which are very similar to precursors of the world wars, we must acknowledge that there are things like the Detroit scandal, which showed evidence that the NATO Secretary General was being blackmailed and participating in horrible things in Belgium. And there's a reason that NATO is in Belgium. And what I encourage people is to understand that we must stand up at the local level across the world against those who would use the military might of America as the mad attack dogs globally. And that's what I was in the Marine Corps, and I can acknowledge that now, but I am now saying to the world that, hey, America is not in control of its own foreign policy. So those who would want to blame us and put all of that at our feet, there is a supranational group of oligarchs They're very heavily in with the bankers. The original CIA before the OSS dudes were all Wall Street and London dudes. We have to really wake up to what's really going on.
Okay, Clayton, best of luck in your campaign for President of the United States. Thanks for the call. Jonathan emails, most certainly Biden is in cryogenic storage in California and will be reheated when science comes up with a cure for buffoonery. Kudos to the actor who's been playing him for 3 years. Your show is #1 in Midtown Manhattan, says John in Manhattan. Ma, I'm at the top of the heap. I'm #1 in Midtown Manhattan. Many thanks indeed. The man who's #1 for me is Niko House, whose commentary, whose analysis is sharp and biting and funny and colorful in every way. Here he is, Niko House, back on the mother of all talk shows. I want to throw you a curveball, Niko, because I didn't have time to tell you I wanted to ask you about this, but I do, because I'm much occupied by the consequences of he who cannot be named and what's happening to him at the moment. I wanted to ask if you knew what was happening in the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein's client list. And Ghislaine Maxwell is in jail forever for trafficking kids. To whom? To whom was she trafficking them? And why isn't anyone apparently investigating that?
Yeah, no one's investigating it. And like I said about the situation with who shall not be named, I just found it extremely bizarre that this major media conglomerate would invest more than a year's actually, worth of resources into investigating a man over sexual assault or sexual misconduct allegations as if it's supposed to help the public in any way. If it is true, then may they get justice. If not, then may justice be served to us. But when it comes to this client list with Epstein, that we know Epstein was guilty. We obviously know Ghislaine Maxwell was guilty. But at this juncture, we actually might have to make a phone call to the Ghostbusters to find out who they were trafficking those kids to. Because as far as we can see at this point, they're all disappeared. They must have been ghosts, because according to the media, according to the Justice Department, both here and the justice system over in Europe, they don't exist. And that shows duplicity within our justice system. And it really reveals that this situation, although they may or may not get justice, was really never about justice or genuine accountability. It was merely about demonizing someone who is speaking out against the system. And that is, once again, regardless of whether or not the allegations do turn out to be true.
Well, of course, that's exactly what they're doing with RFKJr. They are sidelining him, slandering him, censoring him. And now we've got guys pretending to be US Marshals with a gun under every shoulder and lots of spare ammunition turning up at his rally in California just a few days ago. And Joe Biden will still not provide state security for a guy called Kennedy, whose father was murdered in California. And he's got a statue of the original RFK sitting behind him in the White House. What's that all about?
It's bizarre, but I will say, if I was RFK Jr., I really wouldn't rely too much on Secret Service because, well, we've already seen how that has gone with Kennedy, members of the Kennedy family in the past. So his private security, not the police force, like the local police force, not the FBI, his private security caught the imposter and took care of it. But I will say that it speaks volumes to the fact that Joe Biden is at best unconcerned with the safety of a man who was running for president, who was part of a family that unfortunately has a history of being assassinated, specifically when they're challenging the system or the status quo. So if, God forbid, something happens to the man, but like this is a reality that we have to deal in because we understand the times that we are in and we understand history. If something happens to the man, then Joe Biden is complicit in that. And it's viewed even worse to me because not only is he complicit, but he directly benefits from it. So it's extremely problematic.
Yeah, what's even more extraordinary is it doesn't even seem to be a big story anywhere. It's a story that seems to me ought to be being reported not just everywhere in the United States, but actually it's a global story. It's got everything. Jack Kennedy gunned down, Bobby Kennedy gunned down, Bobby's son's running for president, and the US will not protect him. I mean, why is that not a big story, Niko?
There's also another aspect of the story that should probably also make it a bigger story, which is that this actually violates primary orthodoxy. So Kamala got Secret Service very early on in the primary, and people forget about that. Barack Obama was not leading the primary, nor was he holding a federally elected office when he was running against Hillary Clinton in the primary. And he got Secret Service protection because of all the death threats that he had received. Now, once again, RFK has received those same threats. He literally had someone make an attempt on his life. Thank God it was unsuccessful, but it happened. And once again, and it can't be stated enough, he's a Kennedy. He was challenging the system. He is a target. And the fact that this story isn't bigger, the fact that the mainstream media isn't challenging Joe Biden on this, once again, it's not only just revealing to how much they could care less if something was to happen to Kennedy, but it shows how complicit they are. Almost as if, if it happens, it happens. And given the rules changes from the DNC in every way that they've foundationally changed their primary process in order to directly hurt Kennedy and help Joe Biden, it rolls right in line with the narrative, which is what makes it a bigger problem.
Mind you, the security cameras in that darkened theatre were sharp, weren't they? I mean, I could tell you, I won't for reasons of propriety, what bra size Lauren Boebert has. Because the camera in the dark was able to bring us in glorious clarity her décolletage on a date with her boyfriend. And this is now everywhere in the United States and around the world. Some things are important, some things are not, Niko.
Yeah, that's exactly the way it's being treated. Democracy is being trampled upon right now. In the case of RFK Jr., once again, people don't know because it's not being discussed because the Democrats are claiming that there's not really a primary that's going on, while simultaneously telling New Hampshire Democrats that they must violate their constitution and allow South Carolina to be the first state in the Democratic primary, which is not allowable. They actually have to go through Republicans to approve of that process. So it's not going to happen, and they're going to punish New Hampshire for holding their primary on time. Their Iowa is no longer, the Iowa caucuses, the first caucus in the nation, is pretty important. They're not caucusing. They're doing 100% mail-in ballots. Yeah, like what could go wrong with 100% mail-in ballots in the Iowa caucus? In these two states, by the way, both of those states, Joe Biden lost.
Yes, of course, and they want South Carolina because if you ain't black, if you don't vote for Joe Biden, you ain't black. That's why they want South Carolina to be the first, isn't it?
Exactly. You know that it will, for me, it was such a wake-up call to watch Jim Clyburn reach into his closet and blow off the dust off his best tap dancing shoes and literally endorses segregationists and ahead of one of the most important elections of all time. But that's what they're counting on, is that he can save himself the embarrassment because he didn't just get beat by Bernie in New Hampshire and Iowa. He got beat by Bernie, Buttigieg, Klobuchar in New Hampshire, and Warren. So they're trying to save themselves the embarrassment, but yet they keep saying they don't feel threatened by RFK Jr. So, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Which one is it? Either you're threatened or you're not. But in my opinion, they clearly are threatened, and not just by RFK Jr., obviously by Cornel West and Ways as well. So we'll see how it plays out going forward. But people need to know about how the Democrats are still rigging this process, because it is our democracy that's being trampled upon.
And what about Trump? Is he going to make it to the starting gate, or are they going to successfully hobble him?
I think he'll make it. I mean, people forget that in America, land of the free, home of the brave, you can be a felon and be the president of the United States of America. People forget about that. You could be in jail. You know, you can make some adjustments, so bring in some blue carpet, set up some Secret Service. I mean, some of these rappers who go to jail probably have better security than the president of the United States, and better and more luxury as well in their jail cells. So they can do whatever they want to Trump at this point. It seems like the reality is every time they try to pin something on him, he becomes more popular. Like, it is like a direct correlation. And every time something comes out about Hunter Biden, they try to pin something on Trump. Joe Biden's numbers fall and Trump's numbers rise. So at this point, they're just poking I would say a sleeping bear, but Trump is definitely not sleeping. But they are poking the bear. And they're really in my opinion, the Democrats are in a very impossible situation. Because if RFK runs, this might be the one time, because he said that he might run his third party. He said he would seek alternatives if the Democrats keep engaging in these shenanigans. So this might be the one time where they are correct. He will be a spoiler. He will take 10 or 15% of your votes, and the rest will vote for Trump. And it will be very hard for you to finagle your way around these voting machines like we know the Democrats like to do in order to get Joe Biden back in the White House.
I think if Kennedy runs as a third-party candidate, Biden loses. Harris loses even more heavily if she's the candidate, because I don't see any way in which Bobby Kennedy doesn't get 10% of the vote. And if you take 10% of that great vote that Joe Biden got last time, 81 million people apparently voted for Joe Biden last time. If you take 7 million of those off, he loses.
Yeah. And more importantly, even before we even get to the election, by name recognition alone, he has a high probability to make the debate stage by the requirements that have been previously instituted. So he can not only win just in a straight up election, but he could directly challenge both Donald Trump and Joe Biden in a way that the entire world would see. And I hope that that comes into fruition. I mean, people should know by now, I don't believe that America has a democracy. So, you know, it is what it is, but the conversation is important because conversations bring change.
Absolutely. Niko House, as always, brilliant to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. The poll is 14,327, and 31%, 32%, 30%, and 33%, so just under a third of voters, think Google rules the West. But 2/3 almost think it's NATO, by which we mean, of course, the United States. 66, 61, 65, and 64. But here's, for me, the headline. This is the score of those who think democracy rules the West. 3%, 7%, 5%, and 3%. Do the math, as the Americans say. I'll be right back. Stay tuned. Do you know how many people watch MSNBC? If this was a normal business, it would be out of business long ago. Do you know how many people watch CNN? We are in danger of fixating too much on the liberal hegemony of media outlets with infinitesimally small viewership. This show that you are watching has 10 times the viewership. 10 times the viewership of Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV with its budget of billions. So, let's not lose hope. Let's be our own media. You're right, not everybody watches me, watches those other people that you watch. Well, it's your job, and it's everybody else's job that's watching this and agrees with me this evening. It's your job to tell as many other people as you possibly can what we are all about, how to find us, encourage them, and check up afterwards whether they took your advice, and if they didn't, encourage them all over again. Have you any idea how we would multiply if everybody watching this did that? The best part of 2 million people will watch this program over the next 7 days. If those nearly 2 million spoke to one other person, we'd be 3 million if their advice was taken. And so on, and exponentially on, it is possible to go. It's in our hands. Let's do it. I can't do much more than what I'm doing. I need you, the audience, to spread the word.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
An email from Kevin. Good evening, George. The transgender BS is to make us divided because they're running out of ideas to keep us divided. Well, I don't know. I had a little bit of a bust-up with Rehol in Bordeaux last time. Let's see if we can find any further agreement in tonight's conversation. Rehol in Bordeaux, I raise my chapeau to you. How are you?
Oh, hello, George. I'm feeling a little bit sad about poor old Assange tonight, and I wanted to talk about him and King Charles III's current visit to France. I think it's interesting to consider I think it's interesting to consider the issues thrown up by Charles's visit and how they can be linked to Assange. First of all, I want to say I think it's wonderful the way that you often mention Assange and that you remind us of the great debt that we owe him for opening our eyes to the fact that wars waged by the US and or other NATO members are very wrong. And he's presented strong arguments that these wars are sold to the public on false premises and that the real goal is, in fact, war for money's sake because these actors make money from these wars. And he's also shown the contempt for human life that these actors have, and he's highlighted the terrible plight of the civilians and the soldiers in the theatres of these wars. So I was delighted to read in the UK press that this week a delegation of Australian MPs will be visiting Washington to lobby their counterparts for Assange's release. So there's hope, I hope. And now I'd like to turn to Charles's visit because I was struck by what I think is the hypocrisy of the UK and also by the contrast of the material conditions in which Assange on the one hand lives and those of Charles on the other. Charles visited the tomb of the unknown soldier on the Champs-Élysées today and paid his respects. And I thought that was terribly ironic because to me, the king of the unknown soldiers is in England, languishing in Belmarsh prison. And I know, the original tomb of the unknown soldier in Westminster, unknown soldier in Westminster and in Paris was for the unknown soldier in the First World War. But I think, Assange now is, the king of international unknown soldiers. And I was also struck, by the lavish lifestyle of Charles. I mean, you talked about his visit at the beginning of the programme, and that was great what you said. And on mainstream media in France, the reports have been showing Macron and Charles And, you know, they have both appeared in all their finery before the magnificent chateau of Versailles, where there's been a royal banquet and there's been a great deal of pomp and lots of flag shagging, you know, massive Union Jack and all that. And the mainstream media hardly ever mention Assange. And I just think it's so sickening and unfair. And I hope so much that this Australian delegation can secure his freedom. And I just want to finish by saying thank you to you, George, because you keep him in our eye all the time, and that's great.
Thank you, amen. Thank you, Rahul. It is extraordinary that there were crowds out in the streets of Paris cheering King Charles. You wouldn't get that much of it here in the land where he is actually the king. It's odd that it's happening in a country that actually chopped the heads off their king and queen. But there you go. Email from Enrique. Would you know if they managed to find the missing F-35? I would have thought the Pentagon would have had an app similar to Find My iPhone called Find My F-35. I mean, it is a $120 million jet. Great midweek show, as always. Thank you, Enrique. I thought the best story was when, for a few glorious hours, I believed the story, hoax, that it had actually landed in Cuba and was at that very moment being packed up for shipment to Moscow. Michael is in Dublin on Russian diamonds. I'm all ears, Michael. Where do I find these Russian diamonds?
Good evening, George. I'm very worried about diamonds. Now, I don't know how many diamonds you have, George, but I have a shed full of them out the back garden here, and I'm very worried about diamonds. Now, the situation is the EU and the US are proposing to put on a ban on the importation of diamonds from Russia. Now, this is the last possible sanction they can come up with because, as you mentioned yourself on numerous occasions, all their other sanctions have totally failed. But this is lunacy because diamonds, most of the diamonds, and 90% of the diamonds in the world go through Antwerp, which is in Brussels, Belgium, and that trade will be destroyed. So they're going to destroy their own trade. One of the key members of the alliance for Ukraine is going to be destroyed by this ban on the importation of diamonds. And 90% of the diamonds in the world are actually polished in India. Now, this will upset the Indians because it'll affect the trade in India. And the India will be very upset, and they've been upset with Canada over the last few days over other things, but they'll be upset with the US over this particular ban. So what am I going to do with my diamonds that I have in my shed?
Well, it is quite funny because when the Soviet Union existed, they used to smuggle their subsidy to the British Communist Party in diamonds sewn into the clothes of travellers. And a little fella who was the treasurer of the Communist Party called Reuben Folber used to sit up in his attic in Swiss Cottage, I think it was, and unsew these diamonds from the garments and then sell them down in Hatton Garden in London. And that's how the Communist Party was able to continue. Nice work if you can get it. They say diamonds are a girl's best friend. I consider diamonds to be the most frivolous and foolish object known to man or woman. The cost of these diamonds could buy you a beautiful motor car, could even buy you a house, could certainly buy you 6 weeks wonderful travel around the world, even for a kind of mid-term, mid-level, mid-table diamond. I think diamonds and jewelry in general is junk. And so I find it hard to muster any tears for you, Michael, with your shed full of diamonds, or for the polishers in Antwerp, or for, I'm sorry to say, the Indians either. Thanks for the call. Brilliant. Phone numbers in the UK and Ireland, 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. You call us, we'll call you right back. In the US and Canada, toll free, +1 844 944 3344. And the rest of the world, 44203 966 2625. Some comments on YouTube caught my eye. WTF USA. Pentagon announced that unfortunately Epstein's client list was on the F-35 that went missing. And Reckless Abandon says, Ghislaine's sister Christine's company supplies the US government with computers and databases. Ghislaine just supplied the Congress people. And Brian Holden says, BRICS has a population of 3.2 billion. The G7 only 777 million. So who should represent the global community? Good point. Well made. Fundamentals is in England, in Southend-on-Sea, on the subject of democracy. Go ahead, Fundamentals, if I may. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, George. Thanks for taking me call. It's good show tonight. I've been watching, and the word democracy has been banned around. I'm going to be straight. There is no democracy in the West. There hasn't been for a long time. There's been a lot of dishonesty, and there's been no democracy. Your guy there who just was your guest there, he said two things. Democracy is being trampled on. Then at the end he said there is no democracy. There is no democracy, George. You know this. I know it. People know it. A lot of people know it. No one's got a voice, and it's dishonesty. Politicians normally lie to the people they're trying to reach, but now they're lying to each other, and they've got no shame. Joe Biden standing up there in front of all those people, we must stand up to Russia. The dishonesty. And I must say it, George, and I've got a lot of American friends and I've lived there for 6 years. United States is the biggest stain on humanity. The trouble and wars and grief they've caused people. If the United States had no foreign policy, the world would be a safer place. They are causing everything in Ukraine. Everybody knows this. We all know the truth, George. You know it. We sit here every week. We talk about it. We just talk about the same problem every week. And I think, what are we doing? What are we doing? We're complaining all the time, George. When's it going to stop? When do I have to see an intercontinental ballistic missile flying over Southend? When's it going to stop, George?
Well, yeah, I think, look, thank you for the call. Of course, I agree in much of the substance of what you said, but I need to make a few caveats. First of all, the reality is we don't all know it. You think we all know it. Sometimes I think we all know it. But that can't be true. Because if we all knew it, then it would have to change. So our first task, you ask what we're going to do, our first task is to make sure everybody knows it, or at least a critical mass of people know it, so that we can apply the political pressure required to force a change of direction, whether by voting, or by marching, or by protesting, or the audience of shows like this rising exponentially, whilst the audience of the mainstream plummets away to almost zero, phone-ins to radios, letters to the editor. There are all manner of means by which we can demonstrate, to use your phrase, that everybody knows it. But it isn't true, and we mustn't confuse the thousands with the millions, the millions with the tens of millions, which is where we need to be. And thousands are not millions, hundreds are not thousands, dozens are not hundreds. We still have a long way to go. to persuade your neighbors, brother. I'm willing to bet that most of the people in your street don't know what you know and I know, and most of the viewers of this show know. So we better get busy in making sure that street by street, city by city, country by country, everybody does know the truth. And the second point is that the democracy was always a lipstick on the pig. It was to make our system less unattractive, let's put it that way, than it would look naked. But that doesn't mean the idea of democracy, of government of the people, by the people, for the people, is not the best form of governance. It is. Parliaments and congresses and senates and all the other paraphernalia, they come and go, historically speaking. And most of them are now rendered, obviously, not fit for purpose. But the core essence of democracy, of the people themselves deciding the way in which they want their society to go, is an idea that we must cling to. We must recapture. We must show people that we are the people who truly believe in democracy, not these hypocrites who just painted it as lipstick on a pig. Email from Gilbert regarding Niko House. What an interview. Brilliant. World class. He really is, Niko House. World class. Make sure you follow him. YouTube comments. Graham 7. I love me some Niko. Back to the lines then. It's Phil in Sweden on gender and Ukraine. This may take some time. Go ahead, Phil.
Hi there, George. I'm greatly appreciative of you and your show. You're a rational and incisive, provocative voice which encourages international debate. That's why I love you. Okay. Greetings to your worldwide audience. I'm also a huge follower of your guests this evening, Douglas Macgregor, previously Brian Beletic, Danny Haifong. I'm not sure if you know Alex Christoporou, or an Australian military man, Willie OAM. You know, I'd really encourage you to get Alex Christoporou and Willie OAM on your show. I want to give also... Okay,
we'll make a note of that, Phil.
Okay, I want to give respect to your guest this evening, Rihal, for bringing up Assange. Her description of Assange as possibly the international unknown soldier actually touched me and was very poignant. And I want to wish you and your family the warmest wishes and good health. I'm not sure if you might recall, I'm your resident Swedish astrophysicist. Back in July 2018, you invited me onto MOATS to contribute to...
I do. Okay, you are our astrophysicist. Thank you for coming back on.
I watch you. I watch you all the time. You keep me sane. I mean, you have a grasp of international politics, and it's balanced and enriching. And I'm sure your entire audience shares that view. I'm pretty certain. You know, am I allowed to say a couple of sentences about my astrophysics research or not? Can I just say a couple of sentences?
Please do. I'm all ears. I'm no astrophysicist, but as I look up in the sky, I say, as Shakespeare did, there's more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in our philosophy. I'm absolutely convinced that the future lies out there, Phil.
Well, okay, I'm going to calm you a bit here because I've made a major discovery under the Greenland ice. So I found the signature of a massive blue star which died 15,000 years ago and how it impacted the Earth's climate. So this is all in my book, And So the Snake Spoke, and So the Snake Spoke, under the pseudonym Jeffrey Dixon. So that book is free on Amazon. That story belongs to all of us, okay? There's one more blue star left, okay? decoding. So I spent 15 years on this. So decoding of the messages in all of the stone monuments around the world suggests that when that remaining blue star hypernovas, there's going to be some bad news. And I've decoded all the monuments. It's in my book. It's free on Amazon. And So the Snake Spoke. We're heading back to the Stone Age. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. Please read the book. It's free on Amazon. And So the Snake Spoke, Jeffrey Dixon. Now I want to talk about genderism. So I'm a researcher. I've spent 15 years researching all those ancient monuments, all the data. Everything you say, I totally agree with. So let's talk about the meaning of words. So human. We are humans, okay? Human. So a man comes from the word human, and the word woman comes from womb man. That is where the word comes from. Womb man. So a human with a womb is a womb man or woman. I don't want to upset anybody. I'm sorry, but that's the etymology of the word. That's why the word is womb men or women. Okay, that's where the word comes from. I'm sorry, but if anyone's out there who thinks that women can mean anything else, it cannot mean that. I recently made a discovery. So looking at etymology, let's take something I discovered. So the word pillbox, it really irritated me. What does Wikipedia say about pillbox? It says that it's a fortification in the war. It's in the shape of a box for pills. That's in the Webster Dictionary. That's in the Oxford English Dictionary. That's completely rubbish. I've researched it. In Swedish language, I live in Sweden, right? So the word pillbox comes from the words in Swedish pilbågs, which means bow and arrow. There is a 12th century Swedish fortification in the center of Sweden. It's still there today. A bow and arrow tower, a pilbågstorn. That is where the word pillbox comes from. I tried to contact the Oxford English Dictionary. No, go away. We don't want to talk to you. You're not a professor of English. We are losing the richness of our language. So I'm sorry about genderism. The word woman for me, and according to the etymology, means a human with a womb. Okay, so we could make some other analogy. Okay, so I phone the fire station and I say, we know what firemen are. We know what milkmen are. Milkmen were men who were on milk floats, and firemen were at the fire station. If I phoned to the fire station, if I would say, listen, can you send the fireman to put out the fire in my house? And someone at the end of the phone says, no, we don't have firemen here. Who do you have? No, everyone here is called a milkman. What do you mean? The people here self-identify as milkmen now. So, they are going to come to put out the fire. And, well, what about the guys who were there? No, they've self-identified as firemen. So we have a problem here that, we can't mess about with language.
Well, look, there were 1,000 people in the center of New York City today. It may have been more than 1,000 who identify as dogs, and they created a tremendous stir in Times Square, howling and barking, and some of them cocking their leg and miturating, and some of them even, I don't want to put you off your supper, but some of them even defecating in public because, well, they're dogs. This is what Colonel Macgregor called the nonsense machine. And we all have a duty to stand up to it. But most of us don't stand up to it, because that way lies opprobrium, that way lies cancellation, and that way, in some countries now, lies imprisonment. Well, we're all going to have to nail our courage to the sticking point, because if we don't, we are going deeper and deeper and quietly into that good night. Phil, wonderful to hear from you again. YouTube comments are flooding in. Nom Mom Yam says Trump can run even if he's jailed. Eugene Debs did that too. Of course, I know that, but the question is, will enough people vote for him if they manage to put him behind bars? Hobo Rody says it's just about the margin of error away from zero that believe that democracy has some sway in their lives. Well, that's true on our poll. Citrus1 says, what good is being able to vote when the candidates they offer you are selected by non-democratic processes? And an email from Alex. George, would like your opinion on the blanket 20-mile-per-hour speed limit imposed on us here in Wales. At the time of writing, over 318,000 people have signed a petition to rescind this ridiculous law. Over 10% of the population in just a few days and counting. It's absurd. It is itself potentially dangerous. And I saw a brilliant cartoon on social media just this evening of a hooker looking through the window of the car and the driver saying, "No, love, I'm not looking for a good time. I'm just trying to obey the new 20-mile-an-hour speed limits." Donald is in Copenhagen on democracy. Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah, hi, good evening, George. Well, I see that, well, you mentioned it here with absurdity. We've moved from nuclear annihilation this evening to gender identification, as if I don't know who I am or what I am. You know, but I'd like to tell you right now, I know what I am. I'm a primate, a half a chromosome from a chimpanzee, according to our dear friend Christopher, our late friend Christopher Hitchens, you know. But the idea is this thing with this gender identification. I'd like to quote Voltaire here. If I can convince you of an absurdity, I can get you to commit an atrocity. This isn't just a joke or something frivolously absurd, but it is something that can be very detrimental to us, in particular in these times with the dangers that we face right now, with this misinformation and identifying things one to the left and the right. It's completely gone off the rails as far as having an intelligent conversation with any about the results of our decisions and what the consequences might be. So, and then I recently heard an interview with Roseanne Barr. You're familiar with Roseanne Barr? She's an entertainer. Roseanne Barr, and she was being interviewed by none other than Piers Morgan. So she was explaining that she is originally from Ukraine, and that her entire family were buried alive by these Nazis. You know. And, wow, I mean, that's a reality that some people have had to live with. And as a child, I grew up in the Los Angeles and the Hollywood area, and I would go home to play with some of my playmates, and your parents would have these tattoos on their arms, you know, literally victims of this Holocaust and this genocide. And the thing about Roseanne, she said something it was very important to realize this and to know this. She said, this guy Zelensky is a Nazi. And Piers Morgan, how can that be? He's Jewish. And her response was, do you really think that all Jewish people like other Jewish people? That kind of nailed it on the coffin, is who do we think we're allied with just because they associate us? I am definitely not anti-Semitic. I'm anti-fascist. I am anti-totalitarian. And if it's a dictator, then I wouldn't mind having a mind like Putin is a dictator than a flock of ignoramuses claiming that they have the freedom to vote and don't know what they're even making a decision on, like in the United States. That is something that really is a difficult problem for the world right now. And I don't see how, with boots being on the ground in that land, that they're going to do much to change anything in the direction of their policies. That's kind of what I wanted to say, and I'm afraid to say it. But
well, you said it. You said it. No, you said it peerlessly. The best call of the night, and you proved the old adage that this is the global university of the airwaves. A man from Hollywood living in Copenhagen, calling about democracy, quoting Voltaire and Roseanne Barr. That's what this Open University of the Airwaves is all about. Thanks, Donald. Email from Ray. I've sent you a small donation. You were spot on in your monologue. Thank you for that, Ray. It doesn't matter how aggressively Google tried to censor you. I always send on your MOATS show forward links and sing your praises. Keep up the good work. We need MOATS more than ever. Best wishes, Dr. Raymond Tolstoyevsky. Doctor, many, many thanks. Jolanpa is in Banbury in England on Google. Let's hear what she has to say. Madame, you're most welcome. Indeed, first woman caller of the night.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. Good evening, George. I have only recently came across a gentleman called Dr. Robert Epstein. Infamous name, but, well, maybe he can sort of bring it back to the public. He has done quite prolonged research on Google. You can find out a lot about it on his webpage, which is called mygoogleresearch.com. And recently,
I'll definitely do that. I'm on their case. I'm on their case. I'll definitely do that. Go ahead. Tell us more.
Yeah. What he has, I have listened to his interview with Kim Iversen, I think, a few weeks ago.
Oh, yes.
And he has got a receipts on, how many millions votes Google has been able to switch to Biden in 2020. And how he is coercing and manipulating public opinion. And he has got he's building a system which monitors what Google does and is able to stop it with this. When he has testified in front of the Senate in US, I think a few years ago, he was told that he's in danger of being assassinated within months, which didn't happen, but unfortunately his wife died in a quite obscure car accident. And the car from the accident wasn't even forensically examined, disappeared.
Wow. Well, we'll definitely be looking further into that, and that is a very, very interesting call indeed from Jolanpa in Banbury. It's not that I have a particular down on Google any more than I have with any of the other mega corporations. I'm against their hegemony in all fields. I've spent my whole life fighting against hegemony in the world, hegemony in the country, hegemony in the information sphere, and I don't want to be one of those who pretends that there was a golden age. There's never been a golden age. I've been around so long that I've lived through now both ages. The age of monopoly, control of the media, a small number of television companies, a small number of newspapers, owned by an even smaller number of very rich men who pretended, at least, that there was something noble about their profession, but I always knew that they were lying because I lived through some of the most spectacular ways in which they lied and deceived. I lived through, I knew a man called Ted Short, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of Britain. He was the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party when Harold Wilson, who became a friend of mine, was the Labour Prime Minister, 64 to 70 and 74 to 76. And Ted Short woke up one day to discover simultaneously that I think it was £200,000 had been deposited in a Swiss bank account in his name, which was not his, and the money did not belong to him. And simultaneously, he went to the front door and picked up a then popular newspaper to discover the story of the illicitly set up account and money was on the front page of that then popular newspaper. I knew that the small number of oligarchs who owned the British media considered Harold Wilson the 4 times elected Prime Minister of Britain to be a KGB agent and were complicit in the fake scandals to which Mr. Wilson was subjected, all of which had a damaging effect on his health. I lived through the strike of the miners when the entire might of the media and the state were bent upon destroying this proud body of working class men that went miles below the earth to hew the coal upon which our society and our economy was so dependent, and how these men who by any objective standards were noble and heroic were turned into villains and enemies by the oligarchs that owned the media and the hirelings that hundreds of whom I knew personally would pour out their venom, or rather the venom of their owners, against this proud community, these miners, their wives, their children, their communities, their society. So I knew that the old world, if you like, in media was no golden age. And of course, like others, I rejoiced in the possibilities implicit, which are still implicit, in the internet, in the ability of people like me to speak to people like you, and people like you to speak back to me from America, from Stockholm, from Dublin, from Southend-on-Sea, from Bordeaux, just in this evening's show, the enormous North Dakota, yeah? The enormous possibility in that. I'm not blind to. But our problem is this method by which we are communicating with each other is now in the hands of an even smaller number of people than controlled the newspapers and the media before. And they are just as dangerous, just as ruthless, just as self-serving as the oligarchs of yesteryear. I now realize I was being told North Dakota because Claude in North Dakota is on the line, and he's the last caller of the evening. Claude, most welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Galloway. I truly appreciate all that you do and listen to you every chance I get. As a consequence of listening to your program and others, I spent 12 years in a government school and hated every day of it but one, and that was when my dad took me duck hunting. I'm 75 years old, and now I'm in your university, and so I'm learning, and I'm very thankful for it. I'm at the moment, the last half hour, I'm trying to give you a few dollars on Patreon, and I'm not having a very good time of it, but I'll keep trying. I'll get her done. So, I can't. God bless you, Mr. I can't tell you enough. God bless you. So, you watch yourself, and I'll be praying for you, sir.
Thanks, Claude. The power of prayer is something I believe in. But as I've said many times here, I have no fear of anything or anyone other than God. I have tried, at least over many decades, to live a good life, to live a life that might help me get past the pearly gates and admission to a better life in the other place. But either way, I will not back down. Anyone who knows me knows since I was a child, a fellow called Brian Parks was the first to learn I don't back down. He was a bully who spat on me as he ran past me in the street. Foolishly for him, when I was walking a young girl called Linda that I loved, I was about 10 years old. And without going into the grisly details, he didn't have many teeth by the end of the tussle. I don't back down. And whether I lose or whether I die, confronting the forces that control for their advantage and to the misery of the mass of humanity, I'm ready to do that. I'm ready to meet my Maker at any time. And I live each day with that in mind, partly because of the stands that I take and the risks that I take, but also partly because of my age. You're older than me, but not by that much. I hope to live a longer life for lots of reasons. But if I do or if I don't, the work I'm doing now will live on. And the people I have influenced, even just tonight, that influence will live on. As a much greater man than me, Comandante Che Guevara said, what matters is not that I die, but how many people run to pick up my rifle. I have no rifle, at least not one I'm going to tell you about. But my words are my bullets. And I hope, and I'm touched, as you can probably tell, Claude, that someone in North Dakota was so influenced that they wanted to make that beautiful call as the last call this evening on the mother of all talk shows. Thank you for it. So the poll results are overwhelming. NATO is the largest villain of the piece, with a third of the voters thinking Google rules the West, and a tiny, tiny handful believing that we're ruled by democracy. I've no time left. Indeed, I've overshot my time limit. Please forgive me. I'm going now to watch my team, Manchester United. I have no idea of the score in the Champions League of Bayern Munich. It finished an hour or so ago, but I don't know the score, so don't tell me. I'll be back, though, God willing, on Sunday at 7 p.m. UK time with the mothership, the mother of all talk shows. Please be there, and please bring somebody else with you. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. I wish you all a good night.